Hello, I'm Executive Editor Dave Nordman from the Telegram and Gazette. We're joined today by Congressman Richard Neal and Gary Hutner, also from the Telegram and Gazette and Coulter Press. Representative Neal, welcome. Representative Neal represents the 1st Congressional District. Born in Worcester, proudly. He represents an area, a large area, 87 cities and towns that stretches all the way from Dudley in the east to the New York border. First elected in 1988, he is the dean of not only the Massachusetts delegation, but all of New England. Currently, he serves as chairman of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee. Welcome today.
Delighted to be here.
Many of our questions today in our Facebook Live segment were asked by Telegram and Gazette readers. The first of which, Congressman, is there any end in sight to the shutdown? The Senate reportedly is voting tomorrow on bills that would fund the federal government. Would you be so kind as to describe sort of where the impasse stands at this time?
I think much of this is based upon a campaign promise that the president made 2 years ago, and I think that it is meant for him. It's the bottom line in anything and everything that he proposes and suggests. And if I could just give you the geek's perspective on this for a second,
Absolutely.
Which I'm accused of from time to time. We reached an agreement in December on what is known as a continuing resolution that would kick the spending dispute into the next year. But of that dispute, we reached agreement on 6 of the 7 spending bills. So there's really one bill here that is causing the havoc, and that is the Homeland Security legislation, because that's where the funding proposal that the president requests would be included. So most of us would stick to the position on the Democratic side of the following: open the government and let's negotiate that spending bill. I do think that there is some room here based on what the Senate intends to do this week. I think the messaging has just about run out of room for everybody. And I think everybody understands that there are certain positions that each side adheres to. The difficulty with the president's proposal over the weekend was that he was asking for a permanent fix based on his request and offering a temporary fix based on our request. So I believe there is some room in the sense that once the venting takes place, but not to miss the following. There are 800,000 people right now that are, in many instances, working without pay. And trying to reach to the following pay period in our lives is difficult enough. And I think that for these individuals, there's a human cost that should be factored into this dispute. And I would prefer that, based on my experience in the House and the years I've been there, I would prefer that we put these matters aside and negotiate. I'm more than happy to go into the room and negotiate with a friend or foe.
And you've been, you've been in Congress for 30 years, and there have been government shutdowns in the past. How is this one, obviously different than the ones in the past, and how are the previous government shutdowns, quickly resolved?
Well, the previous government shutdowns, I think, were about a broader range of issues, generally on legislative priorities. And in this instance here, this is about really one specific issue. I think that the tailoring of the argument has been based upon the president's request for $5.7 billion. Now, I don't think that for people like myself that we're for open borders. I'm not. And I'm not for abolishing ICE. But I do think that it highlights one of the difficulties that we have in the modern legislative arena and debate, and that is the inability of a president and Congress to reach an agreement on immigration reform. I mean, the city of Worcester has a very handsome history of immigration reform, as does Springfield, and as does Pittsfield, and as does Boston. We were cities that maybe not in a tidy way welcomed all the immigrant groups, but they were the ones that provided the labor that was necessary to fuel the great economic growth that brought this state to preeminence at one time in terms of its manufacturing history, for example. So I think that when you consider that of the 10 million people that are undocumented in America, the overwhelming problem with the undocumented is it is people who have come and overstayed their visa. And the difficulty is they make their way into the underground economy. And a footnote that I think you might be interested in, that I think is important because we oversee the Social Security subcommittee at Ways and Means. Undocumented immigrants in America, they provide about $8 billion a year in surplus to the Social Security Trust Fund, largely because they have used phony Social Security cards and numbers. But the truth is, to collect the Social Security benefit down the road, you have to actually show up and post identification. They're never going to derive that benefit. And I think that there are a lot of complicating factors and perspectives to the immigration argument. And immigration in America has never been as neat as we'd like to suggest it has been. But I think here, the country is not being invaded. And I think that's one of the comments that the president uses to raise incendiary rhetoric.
Congressman, you mentioned the human toll of the shutdown. What about the effects in your own congressional district from the shutdown?
Well, I think at the moment you have people that, as you note, TSA, because Western Massachusetts, we would utilize Albany's airport, for example, or we would use Hartford as well as Boston, and even for me today using using Providence to get back to DC. And there is about 10% of the TSA workforce that is calling in sick, and they may well be ill, but I think it's also a bit of a demonstration of the fatigue they feel over this argument. But there's also a threat going forward eventually to school lunch programs. There's going to be a challenge, I think, for some of the benefits that many people come to expect. But the most important part of it is a lot of people live from paycheck to paycheck. And, you know, they provide honorable service to the country. I was in North Adams yesterday, and the school superintendent pointed out to me that her daughter, who is a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy, she's not being paid. Now, even though we've reached an agreement on the defense budget, passed it, that the Coast Guard falls under the jurisdiction of Homeland Security, unlike the rest of the American military, which is part of the Defense Department. So she's not being paid, and she says she's doing her work and she's doing it honorably every day, but she said she's feeling it.
Right. Do you agree with Nancy Pelosi and others who have said that basically the president is holding the government hostage over the wall situation?
I think that the president's position on the wall should be negotiable. And I think that technology, more security at the border through more agents, and to hire judges to adjudicate these cases that are awaiting some outcome and finding, I think that would be very helpful to the argument. I think that in December the president was all in on what we call that continuing resolution that I noted earlier, and he got some blowback from the base of the Republican Party, largely the entertainment base of it, the talk show people and others. And he, in a matter of hours, changed his position. And I think that his position has narrowed, if anything, over the course of the last few weeks. So singularly, it's the wall.
Do you, and not to put you on the spot, do you think he gets his wall?
I think that we could figure out here how to do, I've actually had a chance to visit the border. So I saw the parts of the wall that are already up. And I think part of his request is impractical, but I do think that there could be a negotiated medium here, where if he were to embrace more technology and more border agents, then part of it, given the natural boundaries of water and all, we could consider something along those lines. But remember that during the course of the campaign, I think if there's one memory that we all have of his candidacy, it was really, we're going to build a beautiful wall. At that time he said it was 2,000 miles. And then he would use the punchline to finish his campaign appearance, and he would say, and who's going to pay for it? And then collectively they would all shout, Mexico. He insisted that Mexico was going to pay for this wall. And he continued to adhere to that position. Even when Mexico said, we are not going to pay for the wall, he stayed with it. So I think that he's left himself open to some of the criticism that he has been responsible for this shutdown.
So in terms of this shutdown, you had asked the Treasury Secretary to appear before the Ways and Means Committee this week to testify on the impact of the government shutdown on the IRS employees. The Secretary declined. Can you describe the current situation with Treasury and IRS funding lapsed and tax filing season on the way? Do you expect the Secretary to appear at some point?
I can tell you this, I expect to talk to the Secretary at 5 o'clock this afternoon,
Okay.
and we're going to have a phone conversation.
Right here, we'll do it right here.
Well, it's part of the responsibilities you have as chairman of the committee. We have oversight of the Department of Treasury, and I actually have had a good relationship with the Treasury Secretary. And I intend to make sure that as we get to our priorities, including a big infrastructure plan for the country, that we're going to continue to talk. I think there are limits to certain parts of outrage, and I think making sure that those tax refunds are on time, considering that a lot of people use that tax refund to pay down debt from Christmas. They depend upon it, and they schedule their withdrawals based upon the need for that refund. So in the conversations I've had with them, and I do think that there was a bit of a political bent to this when they said the Treasury was going to shut down the IRS, and then when they saw the potential for people not getting those refunds, they figured that's a political problem. So they brought back people, employees at the IRS, not paid, to process the refund requests. And I think that as part of that, remember that the consumer is responsible for about 70% of the American economy. So if those refunds were not returned on time, you could see where there would be a real problem given the politics of the situation. But the Secretary and I have had regular conversations. I've been down to the Treasury for breakfast a number of times with him, and we go back and forth, and we have an agreement that there are certain things that we disagree on, but we talk about them in a organized fashion.
And to shift from national politics to local politics, as I said, many of these questions are coming from our readers, and this one comes out of Southbridge. So, you know, some towns like Southbridge, for example, their fire station was built in the 19th century. So, you know, what can you do in Congress to help towns like Southbridge and others in your communities?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I'm glad that the submission was offered, because
Yes.
I'm very fond of Southbridge. It highlights that whole discussion I had about immigrants. And, you know, we've had a lot of success in Southbridge with the Defense Accounting Center. Shot fiber optics in Charlton has done quite well. And the point of the fire station, I have visited it many times because I've helped them with their fire grants. And it's really a first-class operation. If there's a big infrastructure bill, and recall that the president campaigned on a $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill, and the Secretary of Treasury and myself and others, we've had discussions with the Democratic leadership, and the president has said at a meeting at the White House that he is still committed to a big infrastructure bill. So if there is a possibility of utilizing infrastructure for some old fire stations, for example, much the same as what's happened in Massachusetts with the state helping to augment and subsidize school building reconstruction, which has really been a very impressive story that's been underreported everywhere. Virtually every community has used the state as a linchpin for redoing old schools or building new schools. And I think that that might be a model that we could use. But there also, I think when you're talking about fire service, it's part of local government. And there is a bonding capacity that local government would have to borrow money based upon the need to build new fire stations. So I think that there could be a partnership that might be developed here. And the fire grant service, I believe, also offered up an allocation for some work on fire stations. So we could pursue it from that angle. But those are the kinds of questions you like. That's local government at work.
Okay, so let's talk about tax returns. You talked about getting tax returns to the people. Let's talk about one specific tax return.
Do you have anybody in mind?
Yeah, right. So as Ways and Means Chairman, you can request President Trump's tax returns. You've said you plan to do so. Do you plan to do that, and when?
I plan to do it. We are now in the midst of putting together the case, which I think eventually will be a long and grinding legal case. If you remember, the president said during the course of the campaign again that he intended to release his tax forms. And then he said that he couldn't release them because they were under audit. And the Ways and Means Chairman, as the Finance Chairman in the Senate, which has a similar responsibility, the law says that you can request those tax returns. It dates to a 1924 law, and it comes out of the Teapot Dome scandal. But I also think that there's a requirement here to be very deliberative. Every president since Gerald Ford has released his tax forms. And I think that Richard Nixon's tax forms were reviewed by the Joint Tax Committee, which is a group of professionals that I helped to oversee, made up of tax lawyers, CPAs, and economists. So I think that obviously the president would have very complicated tax forms, and I think making sure that they were analyzed in a professional manner, not to meet the outrage of the moment. That is something that ought to be within our quest. But there's another issue here. It's really important. The controversy over BuzzFeed at the end of the week, last week, it drove reporting and it drove statements that upon reflection probably would have been better considered with a deep breath. So the jurisdiction and responsibility that I have here is meant to be handled, as I noted before, with great deliberation and another understanding. There are a handful of jobs in America that can move markets. The chairman of the Ways and Means Committee is one of them. So my responsibility here is most significant, and I intend to approach it based upon that consideration.
Okay. So I guess the question then becomes, what can you discuss publicly and what can't you discuss publicly?
Well, it's my intention, and I hope that the president would voluntarily release the tax documents. I don't think that, given the conversation so far, that there's any indication he intends to do that. But I also think that the public has reasonably come to expect that presidential candidates and aspirants release those documents. And I think that it's likely to end up in a court case. So we need to approach this gingerly and to make sure that the rhetoric that's used does not become a footnote to the court case. And I think that trying to anticipate that is one of the responsibilities that I have. You know, I joined the committee when Mr. Rostenkowski was the chairman. That gives you a timeline. So I've had a pretty good perspective on Democratic chairman, Republican chairman, and the responsibility that the committee has. So we have responsibility for all tax measures. The Constitution requires it. We have responsibility for Social Security and Medicare, which is likely one of the biggest employers in the city of Worcester, and we'll get to that if you want to do the follow-up. We are responsible for the tax portion of Medicaid, but we're responsible for trade, tariffs, pensions, welfare, and management of the public debt. So I am mindful of the historic role that really the only close to permanent committee that dates to the founding of our constitutional system, our representative democracy, has. And I've been meticulous about my choice of words for good reason.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned presidential politics, and recently, even in the last couple of days, many Democrats have thrown their into the ring as far as announcing or close to announcing their candidacies. It's too early to handicap, but there's a lot that seems to be early and often as far as interest goes, as far as Democrats. How do you see it sort of shaking out?
Well, it strikes me that the field will probably be formed fully by August. And then you begin to crystallize ideas and trying to figure out how you set yourself apart from the other aspirants to the White House. On the Democratic side is going to be really important. I think if I would offer a cautionary note, again, based on long experience, I think it's careful not to build aspirations around things that can't be accomplished. Simultaneously, I think laying out the framework for a good plan that talks about economic growth and climate change and acknowledging the role that poverty still plays in America, the complications of still many of the racial tensions that surround the country. I think that those are all worthy considerations. But I also think that electability is a really important part of the quest. And a campaign is about forming a government. So if we offer during the course of the campaign the argument that, for example, I'm woke, you're more woke, but you're surely more woke than the two of us, it becomes more difficult, I think, in terms of a general election. And part of the challenge we have now is that recall that the system starts in Iowa, moves quickly to New Hampshire, moves quickly to South Carolina, and then on to Nevada. So it strikes me that you could have probably by late winter a more narrow field after the test becomes reality. And I think that, again, the idea of a campaign is to promote the idea of governance. Now that can be boring, stifling, amendments, regular order, maybe big plans that can be sanded on the edges so that we just get progress. And I think that in a country that is so divided, I think that some national healing would be a good idea as well.
Do you have any, you mentioned a lot about the process, but haven't really, you didn't mention any names specifically. There are a lot of names out there. Any that you'd like to discuss, people who maybe have, that you've talked to or others have talked to about their candidacies?
Yeah, I've had conversations, that's for sure, and I don't want to give up the privilege of that conversations, but I know many of them.
And what sorts, without naming names, what are the sorts of things that they ask you or advice that you would give them?
Well, you know, one of the nice things I think that they've sought my counsel on some complicated issues and how to talk about them and how to handle them. And I don't present myself as being a genius, but when you spend the amount of time that I've spent on many of the arguments that I've offered to you this morning, I always think it's important when people walk away from you, they don't have to agree with you. They simply have to say he knows what he's talking about. And I think that that's the better test case for all of us. So in these instances, you know, the candidates, the Democratic leadership, they have sought my counsel, and again, it's based upon, I think, some reputation for drilled down knowledge of specific issues.
So you
Yeah.
so you
Go
say you
ahead.
don't want to mention any names, so we'll do that.
Yeah, I thought you might.
Okay, so
Yeah, I'm really not surprised that you're going to do that. Let us do it.
right. So obviously we'll start in Massachusetts because Elizabeth Warren
Yes.
is our senator. So has she asked you for your support, and would you be inclined to back her?
I've spoken with Senator Warren. She did not ask me for support. She wanted to alert me to what she was doing, and we talked about some of the bigger issues that confront the country. And we're used in Massachusetts to having senators who are national figures, and she's one of them. And I think that in a very short period of time that she has really climbed the ladder of presidential politics. And I also think that in the arguments that she has made over the course of the last 4 or 5 years, many of those arguments have cut to what is one of the handful of biggest issues that's going to confront the country. And whether your politics are left, right, and center, it's immaterial. The reality is that there is greater concentrated wealth in America. And if we were sitting here in the city of Worcester 50 years ago, the manufacturing economy with strong unions would have meant that there was a larger share of the wealth that was being passed on to the employees. And when you consider today that half the people that get up and go to work every single day in America are not even in a qualified retirement plan. So and during the course of the conversation, I have raised these sorts of issues because I've spent a lot of time on retirement in my career working on it, and intend to pursue it with due diligence as chairman of the committee. And I think that the issue of economic security is going to be really important. But back to that Worcester case, the economy here for the people at the top and the people who were in the employee base, it was based upon a more shared vision of responsibility. And unions, which at that time, during the New Deal, recall that 1 out of 3 households in America, 1/3 of the American people, their families, were in a union. And when you consider today that that's 6% of the private sector and about 7% of the public sector, it's changed the dynamic. So here, again, back to the city of Worcester, it's the following, that there was a shared result of the work, and there was a sustained ability for people to earn a decent wage, good vacation, good retirement. And now the challenge, even with a gig economy, globalization, the rapid advancement of technology, is transforming the workplace. And I have passed that on to Senator Warren and to other presidential candidates who have spoken with me.
A question everybody has, as you mentioned, retirement. You still have the energy. How long do you see? I mean, 30 years is a long time in Congress. It seems like there's no plans to find a successor to Representative Neal anytime soon.
Yeah, I've not been helping that cause, I can assure you. I think I think it speaks really well of the people of Central and Western Massachusetts that they now have in Congress the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee and chairman of the Rules Committee. Pretty remarkable. And you'd have to go back to Tip to even come close to that. And we have not had a chairman of the Ways and Means Committee from Massachusetts, I think, since 1870. But you know what's interesting about it for the people that are good political junkies? We've now had a committee member from Massachusetts since Jimmy Burke. So for almost 50 straight years, whether it was Jimmy Burke, Jimmy Shannon, Brian Donnelly, or myself, pretty interesting about your committee assignment is destiny. And you know, I used to, with some context, I used to sit on that first row when I joined the committee. And my fondest hope was that Rostenkowski would remember my name. And now to have been able to climb the ladder of congressional success to be the chairman of the most important committee in the Congress.
And as the dean, and it must be you know, refreshing and nice to see so many new faces from the New England delegation, and you know, joining you this year.
Well, it's important because I do think that fresh ideas are important, and I think that they should be vetted, and if you can't decide that you agree with them, that's one thing, but I also think that it's like a farm system in professional baseball. This is where the next round of talent comes from. And I've always thought that, I've always tried to keep at least one foot in the new world, and I think that's really important. So my response to the new members, for example, of the Massachusetts congressional delegation was, you won an election. Your family, welcome. And I've made sure that the two of them in the Massachusetts delegation have the first request that they made for committee assignments. And our delegation is in Massachusetts. We are on every good committee. And I learned that from Joe Moakley, and Moakley learned it from Tip O'Neill, and Tip learned it from John McCormick. So we have paid attention to the idea that it's not just the cable shows that create your destiny. It's the good work you do inside of the Congress, oftentimes without fanfare. But you know when and where to place the amendment. You know what you can get, and you understand how far the other side can always go. Now I know that by modern standards, that sounds quaint. But I think that you leave your mark, and we've been used to, in Massachusetts, pretty good members of the congressional delegation.
So we asked you a number of questions, some from our readers. A lot of them dealt with the shutdown and the wall. Was there anything you want to talk about that we didn't get to today?
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, part of the interesting part of congressional life is that when you consider that some of the following, because I'm a student of history and a student of the House in particular, and a student of the committee with broad interest. But one of the nice things about the House of Representatives is that you can become president without having run for president. You can become vice president without having run for vice president. You can get appointed to the United States Senate. You can't get appointed to the House of Representatives. You have to get elected. And every 2 years, it comes fast. And you put your name in front of the public, and it's not enough to say, well, I wanted to do this or I wanted to do that. In terms of accomplishment, you point out the things that you've tried to get done. And then on election day, there's this very extraordinary moment of humility. And the first Tuesday after the first Monday in the even-numbered years, they pass judgment on you. And it's still a pretty awesome responsibility. And the other part of it that's extraordinary, and I hope that some of the young people that might have a chance to see this, I just came from Drury High School in North Adams yesterday, because I visit all the high schools faithfully, community colleges, universities, I'm there. In the history of America, dating to 1789, or at least to our form of representative democracy, with our constitutional system, you've had slightly less than 12,000 men and women who have been elected to Congress. So that means that for the young man, your chances of playing Major League Baseball are far better than winning a seat in the House. For the young woman, your chances of playing on the Professional Women's Golf Tour are better than your chances of winning a seat in the House. In Massachusetts, we tend, once you win, to stay there for a while. And I would argue that that's term limits, and that they decide who should represent them. And most importantly, at re-election time, they decide whether or not you should be re-elected. So it's a pretty formidable judgment that the public offers, and I've been excited to have been part of it for all of these years. And I think that if you're interested at some point, which I hope you are, I'd be happy to do a forum on Greater Worcester's economics, talk about the basis of it. I've spent a career lecturing my colleagues about economics. Fast judgment and understanding of worker participation rates, investment, and the role that taxation plays in decision making. And the point that I raised earlier that I think is really essential, I don't think you can tell the young people here in the city of Worcester and the surrounding communities that globalization is going to retreat. There's not a shred of evidence. If anything, they're going to have to be better at it. So I think the protectionism in terms of trade is a mistake, and I think the idea that we can't compete in the international trade arena is a mistake. And I have, we oversee the United States Trade Representative, so I hear from him all the time. He's got a first-class mind. And those are the sorts of issues that I hope America would just take time out of to discuss. And they're so important to that next generation. I was telling these students at Drury High School yesterday, there's probably never going to be a better time to come out of high school than right now because of technology and opportunity. And when you consider that there are 7 million jobs available in America right now, 7 million jobs, 18,000 precision manufacturing jobs in New England that go unanswered every single day. You can't drive anywhere without seeing a homemade sign in the window that says, "Help wanted." And I think that for all of us, when you consider that there are about 6.8 million people looking for work, and 7 million jobs available, but part of this is it's changes in the workforce and the gig economy. It's opiate addiction. 2 million people are sitting on the sidelines because of opiate addiction. They used to go to work. The economy is being transformed. And interesting story I was reading, we were all talking about the demise of the branch bank. Well, there's more of them now than there have been in a long period of time. So you need technology advances, but you need people and face-to-face contact as well. So the last point I'd make is that a representative democracy works on the basis of informed opinion. So reporters should never forget the role they play in offering informed opinion. And I think that at a time when the public's not really quite sure of what to believe anymore, the confusion that surrounds the national debate, I think we've all got a particular responsibility to get it right. Thank you.
Congressman, we really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule, and on behalf of Gary and myself and the Telegram-Gazette readers who submitted so many great questions, we appreciate it.
I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.